Hi, it's Elizabeth again. I want to talk a little bit about agents of deterioration, which is to say things that can damage your artifacts. A lot of what we do in the collections with our storage and with the new storage area we're preparing in our new museum has to do with trying to mitigate these possible sources of damage so that our artifacts can last as long as possible. So really obvious ones are things like water damage, which we all know and hate. Pollutants, light can be damaging to many artifacts, not to mention things like pests, mold, mildew, insects. The good news is, even though there's a lot of different things that can be causing damage to artifacts, many of the same strategies can use to mitigate against one or more of them. So to start out with light damage, let's see if we can get a good shot of this. Those of you who've been into the museum might recognize the tablecloth that we're using in our vestibule for the last 5 years. And you can rather distinctly see, or at least I can, the light fading effects from where we've had pamphlets sitting on it and where we have had the cloth simply exposed to daylight for about 5 years straight. This is the reason that we don't have a lot of windows in the collection storage area, and museums have a lot of different strategies that they can use to try and avoid and eliminate light damaged collections. So you might see things like UV clings over windows and areas that are providing natural light. You can get filters for your overhead lights. You can get vitrines for your exhibit cases that are UV filtering, because obviously UV does not help us see the artifact, but it is still a possible source of damage. We aren't generally dealing with materials that are quite that fragile, but we'll still do rather basic things like rotate which items are on exhibit. So if we have one dress out on display for 3 months, we can put out a different one that fulfills a similar interpretive objective and thus spread out the damage, because light damage is unfortunately cumulative and irreversible. Other possible issues we could have include water. So even simple things like not bringing a cup of water into the storage area can be important. We can also put items in boxes that will help shield them. As an example, this is a print of a glass plate negative that's in our collection. So earliest 20th century photograph that's taken on glass. And you can see in this print that all this black area around the edges are places where the negative itself was damaged with water, which rinsed away some of the photographic emulsion. It literally rinsed the photograph off of the plate, the stratus that was holding it. And so that is something that is not actually reversible. There's different mitigation techniques you can do depending on what the item is that's been exposed to water, but that's an example of how an item can be damaged by exposure to water. We also have pest damage. No one likes pest damage. So this is a very fun little infant jacket that came to our collection recently, dates to the late 1880s, and it's made out of wool flannel, which is a wonderful material, but is unfortunately very tasty to clothes moths and a few other insect species. They're really into protein these days, which is what wool is made out of. And so you can see on this item all these little spot holes that were insect damage from before the item came into our museum. So in order to prevent that going forward, one of the first things we did is we froze this piece in order to kill any bugs that might be on it. There was no sign of an active infestation. This appears to be an older incident, but that's one of the methods you can take in your integrated pest management program, which is the many different steps that you take to try and minimize, identify, and remediate against damage from pests. So to mediate against pests on incoming items, one of the things we'll do is try and remove any possible eggs, frass, detritus left over from past infestations, and just make sure we aren't bringing anything into the collection. So a multivariable HEPA filter vacuum cleaner is one of the useful tools we can use for that. Notice this one is in fact for artifact use only. It is kept just to help keep our artifacts clean and prevent infestations from coming into the museum collection. So this most often sees use on textiles, furs, and other items that might be harboring webbing clothes moths. Some of you may be wondering why I'm touching artifacts with my hands and not using these pair of white gloves, which brings us to another possible source of damage, which is mechanical damage. The stuff that happens when something gets abraded or torn or isn't being supported properly. And while gloves are really useful for preventing transfer of oils and dirt from one's hands onto an artifact, current thinking in the field leans to the idea that the loss of sensitivity in your hands is actually a greater damage, and so in lieu of using cloth gloves for many types of artifacts, we'll instead rely on regular hand washing and especially hand drying, so you avoid getting water on your artifacts as well. In addition to these measures, general good housekeeping can be really helpful. So things like regularly sweeping and dusting, keeping possible food sources out of the museum collection are ways that will help keep pests at bay. And one of the most important things that we can do, which applies to the entire environment, is monitoring for temperature and humidity. So most artifacts are going to be happiest in a low temperature situation. Pests don't tend to like it, mold and mildew won't like it, and so the artifact's going to be going a bit longer. But also humidity. As we all know, out here in the Pacific Northwest, we get a lot of rain, it gets very humid, and that's another thing that mold and mildew and my beloved silverfish really love. So regular monitoring of our collection space can help us make sure that we're keeping the temperature within a suitably low range, that the humidity is especially not swinging too much. So if we get too high humidity overall, that's when the mold, mildew, and silverfish become more of an issue. So keeping low humidity will discourage those possible sources of damage. But rapid changes in humidity itself can also be a problem. If anyone's ever had like a wooden door swell up during the winters and humidity changes and gets stuck or stop hanging nicely in its frame, that is something that you also have to be worried about with certain museum objects, especially things made of wood or leather, that changes in humidity will make them expand and contract, and that can actually cause damage over time, especially with things like cracking resulting from those changes. So by trying to keep our humidity as consistent as possible and ideally relatively low, that's one thing that can help. So these are all things that we're going to be having to consider with our new location. I'm particularly excited that we're supposed to have a second HVAC so that we can keep all of our artifacts cool, dry, and happy without freezing the museum patrons. And lots of things to look forward to. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll look forward to seeing you in the next video.